Welcome to the Digible Dudes Podcast. I'm David.
I'm Reed.
And on today's episode, although we're a bit slacker because we recorded this yesterday from home,
Yeah.
we just didn't have it in us to do the intro because I think you even said, I don't know if you said on this podcast, Tree, but you were like, I was exhausted after the pre-call.
Yeah. I don't think I did, and we keep saying exhausting in a good way. But yeah, Manny Puentes, dude is a legend. Yeah, at least in my mind.
In your own world.
Yeah. And he was just, we couldn't stop talking about, journeys, backgrounds. And he's definitely what I call a P1. Those are from the radio days of Digible. Big fan of ours. And the more he heard the story, the more he was leaning in. So it was a lot of fun before he even got started.
Yeah. So we met Manny, I think 2 years ago at some sort of ad tech meetup of some sort here in Denver. And he's been the CTO of a number of ad tech startups. So he knows the space well. He's built DSPs and different platforms like that for different customers and companies. And I guess it was just before we launched Digible, but back in 2017, he actually launched Rebel.ai. And the point of Rebel.ai is to combat ad fraud. So a DMP is part of the tech stack where a company would use to help buy inventory to advertise online, like programmatic inventory. And when he was doing that process, he saw all of this funny business going on where
Go ahead, say your word.
Shenanigans.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's shenanigans going on where people were just doing untoward things and sucking up impressions that weren't legitimate and things like that. And so this has become a topic that Reed and I have hit more and more, or got into more and more recently at Digible and how we can continue to combat ad fraud. And we thought it'd be a great topic for the podcast, and we didn't think of anyone better than Manny to have this conversation with.
Yeah, super interesting. And what he was saying, and we were too, kind of in the pre-call, is we don't want to, I guess, scare anybody or over-alarm folks about the risk of ad fraud with the current channels that they're using. And in many cases, and he brought this up a few times, is the closer you get to the source, the less risk you have. Meaning if you're using, kind of the native ad servers within these platforms, be it Google or Facebook and the like, that, it's not as big of an issue, but it still exists. And so that part was, fascinating as we talked through, where are the kind of hotbeds, if you will, of ad fraud, be it by browser, by device, by publisher and things of that nature. So it was a really, really fun conversation.
Yeah. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely stay tuned and listen to this episode. And then I'm sure at the end, you guys will be as eager as Reed and I are to have him back on and just pick his brain again. Yeah. Cool. Well, Reed and I are here with Manny. And Manny, I've never gotten your last name correct, so I'm avoiding pronouncing it. But how do you say your last name?
Puentes.
Puentes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's got a good ring. I wish I had some nice ring to mine. Well, Manny, why don't you start before we get into the ad fraud discussion? But why don't you just start? Give us a little bit of your background, and then what spawned the idea for Rebel, and then what Rebel does, and then we'll jump into ad fraud from there.
Yeah, no problem. So look, I've been in advertising for 20 plus years. Building early platforms. Even actually here, I'm actually based in Colorado and in Westminster. I was working at a company early on called MatchLogic, where we were building one of the first ad platforms. And since then, I've built DSPs and DMPs and all the aspects of advertising you could think of. And, I'd been doing that for a long time and was CTO for a long time at a lot of a couple of companies, and decided that, before I leave this wonderful planet, I should probably start my own company. So that Rebel.ai was born, and we basically are an engineering firm where we, build products, but we also have our own product and patent pending product in ad fraud.
Right. So a lot of things, as you mentioned, DSPs, DMPs, but in the programmatic display space, right? So is that mostly what you guys touch, or like programmatic, like banner ads?
Yeah, and display, video, CTV, pretty much all channels across digital.
Okay. Cool. Well, does that extend into places like Facebook, or is that more close?
Yeah, we've actually built activation platforms that activate inside of Facebook, and we've touched all, from email to PII to pretty much anything you can think of in the digital space. We've either had a hand in building or have built it ourselves.
Okay, cool. And then when you and I think Reed was there when we first met like 2 years ago, but you were demoing, I guess, a platform that you've been working on for some time, which I don't know. Do you call your platform Rebel, or what do you call your ad fraud platform?
Well, we have a fraud solution that we've been working on that's called Passport, and I guess since then we've actually built a platform around it that we actually are going to release here soon. Called Compass. So it's a bigger platform play that allows you to do media buying across all channels and incorporates our security solution. So we're building a security first based solution for activation and closed loop attribution.
Cool. So if I just try to distill this down, and we'll get the setup done, and I'm sure Reed will wind them up and let them go. But a lot of what you had talked about 2 years ago was there's a lot of spoofing that's happening. And look, let me take my like amateur hour. Well, whatever. And I'll say, so basically, first, programmatic display is where let's say you're buying display or video ads online. Instead of calling up the New York Times or the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or whatever, you say, hey, I'm just going to place this through like Google's ad network or whoever. Pick your ad network of choice. We don't have to get into that, but let me buy this programmatically so I don't have to go individually buy these websites. And then I can layer on cool stuff like some behavioral targets or psychographics or something that may be of interest. And but through that process, there's some shenanigans, I guess, that could and might.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So why don't you talk to us about
David's favorite words is shenanigans.
Why don't you talk to us about the shenanigans at a high level? And then I think spoofing was like at least your main thing. I'm sure you go beyond that, but and what that says for like small advertisers online.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you're a small advertiser, you want to put your money to work, and every dollar counts, and you want to ensure that you have good ROI when you're working with someone. But look, it's digital. It's like the Homestead Act, right? I mean, early on, people were just fencing in a lot of digital properties and figuring out how to make money. Like I said, I've been doing it for 20 plus years, but advertising wasn't built with security in mind first, right? I mean, it evolved, and over time, we got better and better, but yet security wasn't, the initial thought on transacting media or finding eyeballs for your brand, right? It was just, hey, I have this digital property, and I have, I curate content, and I have people come to this property, and they have a demographic associated to them that somebody else may want to capture their attention, right? And so essentially, as the evolution of advertising was taking place, if you think about where we are today with regard to how much money is spent online versus someone going into a store, you can see a dramatic shift in that behavior, right? Like, I think where I used to want to go into a store and buy something, I actually want to go online to see all the variety that I may be able to, or all the different brands and items that I may be able to purchase, and get a better deal for what I'm looking for, right? And whenever you see money movement like that, unfortunately, there's a trail of bad actors that come along with that money movement, and they want a piece of that, right? It's no different, banks get broken into because there's money there, right? I mean, I think people are, the bad actors are driven by trying to get their hands on those dollars and in the easiest way possible, and so they're going to exploit loopholes to do it. So digital is no different, because that money movement has happened, and a lot of the e-commerce and a lot of transacting is happening online. These holes started to appear in how you could actually fraud the system, right? And so one of those ways is that there's not really a digital identity, if you will, that represents, let's say that a site that you're looking for, looking to buy an audience on. Let's keep it simple and say New York Times. So New York Times invests a ton of money in curating their content and getting certain demographics or certain people with certain demographics to their site. And they're calculating, they have their own data sets where they're, either need more of a certain type of audience, and where they'll start curating content to get that type of audience, because the way that they make money is through advertisement, right? So in the advertising ecosystem, you have publishers who are curating audiences, and whether it be mobile or sites, and then in the middle you have what we call ad tech. Think of it as the plumbing that connects the site to what we call, not to get too in detail, but let's just say that the connection is made up of a bunch of platforms that we know as ad tech. And then on the other side of that are agencies and brands that are trying to reach the audiences that those publishers have curated, right? And so in the middle there, in that ecosystem that we call ad tech, they know that certain sites have a price point, right? So like a New York Times is going to have more value for a brand because they have the audiences that they're looking for than johndoe.com, right? And so there's money associated to that. And because of the decoupling or the nature of the way that the digital works, these platforms aren't directly connected to each other. And they're that way because they need to provide scale and they need to give the ease of buying to the buyer so that essentially they can go out, find the audiences that they want and not have all of these direct connections across all of these different publishers, because it creates a clearinghouse problem, right? Where you have to now pay all of these people and all these money. It becomes really hard. And I'm setting up this discussion this way because I'm trying to help you understand why these actors are incentivized to even want to go do anything that we deem as ad fraud, right? In that realm, if you will. And it's because they actually want to get some of that money. And that's really bad because the way that they're doing it is through programs like that are known as bots or scripts and computers that are not real humans that know how to interact with all these different platforms. And to keep it really simple, because the value of New York Times domain, when you go to your web browser, you type in www.newyorktimes.com, because that domain has a value associated to it, you're going to get bad actors that are going to put transactions into the system that basically have that are tagged with New York Times, but they're not really New York Times. It's just a computer in some house somewhere that said it was New York Times, right? And so as a buyer or an agency, when you go into these platforms to buy a particular set of audiences that are going to convert for you, they're going in and they're selecting all of these. You're going in and selecting all of these properties that have a high propensity of having the audiences that you're looking for that are going to convert for you ultimately to bring you business value. And when you go into these platforms, literally you're going to put in a string as if you're getting on your keyboard and typing www.newyorktimes.com with no security wrapped around that. And so essentially those bidding platforms are taking in the real newyorktimes.com's audiences and the fake ones. And you don't know which ones you're actually processing, right? And because the granularity of what exists in these platforms don't allow you to just check a box that says, don't give me fake ones, there's waste that you have to process to get to the real audiences, right? And so working with really good agencies that understand these practices and understand what waste means, you're essentially going to hone in your business practices and buying strategies so that you can reduce the waste, ultimately bringing more value to your clients, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say in a nutshell, that's a long way of saying there are real New York Times domains and there are fake New York Times domains that are generated by just computers out on the internet. And ad fraud from a domain spoofing perspective is just simply, I'm buying advertisements that no one ever is going to see. And it's really hard to know the good from the bad because we're so early on, while we feel we're not, we're so early on in this digital age that we're working through those problems.
That's great. So I'm going to hit one one follow-up question, and I want to tee Reed up here. But basically, it's when it comes to ad tech, it's kind of the Wild West in my mind. It's like almost anything goes. I know it's gotten better, and there's been some stuff like, I'll just say, like, people think of the Wild West when they think of Cambridge Analytica and what happened on Facebook, but it's beyond that, and in many ways even more simple than what the Cambridge Analytica thing is, where it's like, hey, your agency thinks, hey, you're a small advertiser, you're going to buy 100,000 impressions, and agency whoever doesn't know better, and they try to buy New York Times as a whitelist through their platform, like the Trade Desk or whatever. And some amount of those impressions are New York Times, but then there's amount of those impressions that are not. And it's I'll pick on Russia right now, but I'll just pretend it's some Russian thing instead. So my follow-up question is, do you have just an assumed, how big of a problem is this? Like, as far as a percentage of impressions, or something like that, out of every 100 impressions, X number of them are probably being intercepted or not really hitting where you think they're hitting?
Yeah. So look, early on, it's funny. Early on, I was always taught to never say, "Hey, that was a good question," because it basically means all your other questions suck.
Me too.
but that is actually a really good question. So if you think about statistics, when you go out, and I encourage all of your listeners to go out and do their own research. But when you actually go out and do your research, you're going to find numbers that are varying across the board. And here's why. You're only as good as your statistical set. So if you went in and you worked with a bad inventory source and they had a large amount of bad actors, then your number clearly is going to get bigger because you're only as good as the lens that you're looking through, right? So you'll run into these reports and say, oh my gosh, we've seen 50, 60% fraud. But the lens that they were looking through was a statistical lens that then they were working with providers that had a large amount of fraud. And then you can look at some of them that say, hey, well, I only had 10% fraud, right? And it was because the audience set that they were working with wasn't as bad, right? So you're only as good as the lens that you work through. Okay. So what's interesting here is that there's never such thing as a good, there's never such a thing as a good deal, even in advertising, right? So if you run into an agency or someone that says, hey, I have traffic that is 10 cent CPM, and you're like, man, my dollar can go really far with that, right? You're probably going to get a lot of bots and a lot of bad traffic, right? So you get what you pay for. Or if you come in and you say, hey, well, I have inventory that's $30 CPM. You're probably working super direct and in a sponsorship placement in a publisher's ad server. And your return on investment is greater because people really saw it. So if you run into the situation and you feel like you got a really good deal, I would look at it again, because quantity obviously isn't quality, right? So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to minimize ad fraud, but you also want to do it where it's at value for you and your client, so you both win.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what's interesting here is that, to answer your question directly, is that it's prominent and it's pervasive and it comes in waves. And when you go out and you read some of these articles and you do your own research, you're going to find that they found a bot network that has been, that essentially has taken over and has wasted tons and billions of dollars, because it's in the billions. And then it'll go away for a while and then it'll come back. and it's essentially those bad actors trying to find these loopholes. And so I would say, if you wanted to know, I mean, you're going to be looking at 15 to 20% of it happening, on an average, and that's just a number I'm throwing out there, right? Like if you're going to go out and try to find that number, I think for me that number just resonates. If you wanted to look at an industry, and depending on the lens that you're looking through at the time of the buy, what you're trying to do is mitigate that from ever happening and lowering that number even lower. But what I would say is that that's just some number that's in my head over the 20 plus years that I've been doing this, that I've averaged out somehow.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I think it's a great number. And it's almost like if you're working with a company that's not super skilled, and look, our audience knows this. We're not a high driven sales force saying, hey, Digible has it all figured out. I'm more of just saying, if you pick up and make your first account today and try to go buy programmatically, you're going to end up with more fraud than somebody that's been doing it a long time that probably have less fraud. And then there's the problem of getting caught, let's say, like of the numbers that you're talking about, how much of those studies, like, did they even really know what was really fraudulent and what wasn't? And so as you're saying, like, if you're a big brand, maybe you're on the 10% side. If you put in a lot of, processes and systems and whatever, but you could be, and I'll say mobile advertising to me is one of those that really hits my nerve about fraudulent traffic. So you could be like 80%, let's say, of going in the wrong places. So it's gonna, and I'm gonna pass it to Reed here in a second. But Reed, you've worked a lot with, obviously, at a high level on the publishing side before, and helping work out getting the most programmatic dollars. So I don't know if this is where you wanted to go, Reed, but and what you would, I guess, be comfortable sharing. But I know you and I have talked many times about how many of those dollars that an advertiser is spending is actually landing on the publisher, and what's getting sucked up by the ad tech in between. And then I'm sure from there, Reed, you'll have whatever, you'll take it wherever you want to go.
Yeah, well, it was an education for me, and it was years ago, just, what the actual net is for the publisher. It's still more than they would get otherwise. And that's what publishers are trying to always, kind of figure out. And so there, a lot of new teams were developed while I was on the media side of yield management, and it became incredibly important and valuable. And they went through incredibly in-depth processes with various providers, in particular on the rich media side, trying to vet through like what were they doing about ad fraud, and ultimately, of course, what was going to be netted to the publisher. And it's amazing. A lot of times we'd be talking about $10 CPMs, but then you'd find out the publisher was only taking 2 of that. And so it had, CEOs, publishers questioning just how much we should be pursuing or opening up our inventory, for the programmatic third party, providers, because it was like, well, with all this inventory now, our direct sales staff can't really sell all that. So a sell through might be good, like as far as inventory at 30 or 40% from your direct staff. And then it's like, well, what the hell are we doing with the other 60, 70% of our inventory? And so there was this great kind of intersection or marriage between programmatic, providers and publishers. But then as you started to learn more about it, publishers was like, well, maybe this isn't as good as we thought. But what they had to come to grips with, and I certainly faced that a lot, was these big homepage takeovers and direct buys were just going away. And people were wising up and saying, we're going to buy audience. We're not going to buy publishers direct. And you still see that periodically when you go to ESPN and a few others, Yahoo, you'll see like with movie trailers and things like that. But more often than not, even those types of ad types, are being bought programmatically. So then the next kind of chapter in this whole thing is where we're kind of at today, talking with Manny about, the fraud itself. And one of the things that I would get kind of pitched on was how much money certain providers would spend on their ad fraud. And that's where, companies like Rebel provide so much value, or so important, frankly, for those companies in order to get bigger deals done. So I remember Undertone, if you're familiar with them, Manny, but they're one of the bigger providers of kind of rich media and docked ad types that would pop up. And they came to us and they were trying to do a big deal with Digital First. And, they're the second largest conglomerate to Gannett. when it comes to local media publishers. And they were like, we spend $10 million a year, which I had no context, but they were like, that's how much we spend every year on monitoring our ad fraud. And then they went on to say, and this was them trying, I think, to be transparent with us, is, for context, guys, like there's a lot of similar ad types or providers that don't even spend $1 million on it. And so you're giving your advertisers garbage and you're creating a bad user experience. And so it was interesting to hear that. So yeah, all this factors into it. I definitely have been kind of pretty, as Manny says, 20 years. I don't have quite that long, but not far off. And so it's been really fascinating to see the evolution and kind of the new companies that are coming up. So I guess I'll turn this into a question for Manny is, where do you see what's the best solution to improve things beyond, companies like yours being born? Is it working more, directly with the programmatic, as you talk about the piping, the providers themselves? So like an App Nexus or Trade Desk, Rubicon, are you actively in conversations with them? Do they already have inherently built into their piping ad fraud? And so you're working or focused more on agencies to try and help improve this problem. And then the third kind of, player in that, maybe a fourth. So you have the programmatic players themselves, like the platforms, the DSPs and the SSPs. Then you have the agencies that are buying in bulk. Then you have the publishers that are kind of, almost in no man's land. And then you have like folks like the IAB, right, that are like policy setters in a way. And they're coming out with all sorts of guidelines, but are they active enough right now in ad fraud? Because they'll tell you these are the ad types and there's all sorts of certifications and education they're trying to provide. But I don't know that they're necessarily or have been a very active participant as far as who and how to approach ad fraud. Certainly I see content from them, but that's kind of, for me, the ecosystem all around ad fraud. So Manny, what are your thoughts as far as who and how to really improve this beyond, again, your companies like yours being born to at least detect this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's been a lot of talk about fraud in the space. And I would say early on, the market or, media trading was based on quantity, not quality, right? Where agencies wanted to go out, be able to capture all the audiences they possibly could, and do it in a really easy way using the programmatic plumbing that you're referencing. Over time, there was a realization, because of all the data that was coming in, that something was amiss, right? Like there wasn't the conversion rates that they were hoping to get. And, fraud started to take hold and essentially started to change the paradigm. And there's a big shift now that's happening from quantity to quality. So you're starting to hear a lot of the SSPs or the ad tech providers saying they work directly with the publishers, right? You're starting to see that value prop in their marketing and their strategy around, hey, working directly with the publishers is going to reduce ad fraud, right? And so that's a big. I think maybe you haven't mentioned it, but you probably heard of like supply side, supply path optimization, and throwing around words like transparency and so on and so forth. This is a way to change the programmatic buying strategies from quantity to quality, and that's a hard shift, because what that's doing is it's going to the market is essentially going to get smaller with providers out there, right, that provide the ability to buy media, because there's only a finite amount of inventory, right? There's a lot of reselling that happens, right? But there's only really a finite amount of inventory. And as you move more to the quality nature of buying, you're just not going to have a ton of that reselling that has been there in the past. Does that make sense? And so that the byproduct of that is that there are more business controls and technology controls to tamper down some of the fraud that we're seeing, right? We didn't mention any of of the third party cookie going away, or in some of the other things that are playing a really big part in some of this transformation, it's actually a really great time to be innovating right now in this space because of the massive changes around, and this is a whole nother podcast, but massive changes around privacy and consumer data and the third party and tracking and retargeting and all of the things that we love to use today to find our consumers are going through a massive change. So I would say, to be very pointed to give you just a very pointed answer, one of the best strategies that is happening today is that we're moving from quantity to quality. And then on top of that, technology can do a better job in identifying some of this fraud. And that's where you're starting to see this. I'm really optimistic about it. You're seeing this massive change around the awareness of fraud and how we're actually going to control it through processes and quality. Yeah,
that's cool. Well, I was going to ask, and I think you teed me up well for this, but quality versus quantity. And frankly, at least with our clients, and we want to try and make this as relevant as we can for multifamily specifically, but what are some basic tips, if there are any out there, to ad buyers? And I mean, this could be directed, at us as an agency that is, really buying on behalf for them. But David mentioned mobile is one of the things that kind of scares him, and potentially has a lot higher fraud. So I don't know if you can expand on that. When I think about, kind of deconstructing, the online opportunities, or ad tech, I think, in general terms, like, is there a difference between browser types, where you see greater fraud, from Chrome to a Safari, because people seem to trust inherently Safari more, right? And then by device. So, what we were just talking about with mobile versus tablet versus desktop. Then you have ad type and creative, so rich media versus static. You have platforms. So is it ad fraud more rampant on a YouTube than it is, in kind of standard publishers? And then of course you have premium publishers versus the ones you talked about, the Joe Schmo, like kind of niche sites, maybe even neighborhood level type sites. So a lot to throw at you, Manny, but I'm just saying, like, if you, and I'm sure you've already, as you mentioned, been on panels, but talking to different agencies, here's some things outside of the technology that Rebel can provide to really, help protect against ad fraud. But some just general good tips or things to be aware of as far as where there's more risk, be it, again, ad type, browser, platform, device, etc. So any commentary there?
Yeah, I would say, it's, I mean, I love the question. I have so many thoughts around it. But I would say first, work with brands that, if you're going out and you're trying to find a provider or technology solution that's going to help you as an agency, do your research. Work with brands that are known, that have been in the space for a while. Like, I'm not saying don't try up and coming companies that, because I mean, look, I live my life in startups. I love up and coming companies, and I think that some of the greatest innovation is happened from those startups that, are born in a garage. But like, if you're starting out, work with brands that right? And like, your trade desks, and work with people that, your beeswax, your, personalities behind companies are what the companies are really going to be like, right? If you see, do your research on the founders, and see, do your homework, right? Like, if you run into a company you've never worked with before and they're selling you cheap inventory, that's probably a sign, right? Like, there's no such deal as a good deal, right? That's one. That's just traditional street smarts, right? Then there's the question list, like, what technology fraud providers are you working with today, right? One thing to note is that there is not a fraud detection provider that is perfect. It's just not possible, right? So what you want to do is work with the best of the best in what you're trying to solve. Does that make sense? Like if you're actually working with the fraud provider, you're going to give your clients the ability to, or you're going to give your clients the confidence to know that you're working with the best that's out in the market to protect them, right? And sometimes that may be the platform partner that you're working with has instituted a lot of the strategies for you, so you don't have to, right? And so I would say, one, there isn't a perfect strategy out there. Two, just work with the best of the best. And then three, which is really important, is look at the data, right? Get as much data as you possibly can and filter through that data and be smart and aware of where your conversions and the value that you're bringing to your customers lies, right? And so I think I know by looking at the data, you're going to find things that work and things that don't work. And because you guys have been in the space and humans have been in the space and you know digital strategies, the data is going to be a strong signal as to whether something's working or not, right? And so I think all of those things are tips for agencies that are starting out to say, hey, I'm going to do my very best to bring the most value to my clients, and I'm going to employ the strategies that I know and the tech that I know works. And then being honest, being honest with yourself and being honest with your clients that says, hey, I've deployed the best technology that I possibly can deploy. Here's the data. Here's your input. Here's your output. And we've put an insurance policy in place to protect you from fraud, right? I think going beyond that and overselling that you're fraud free and 100% transparent, which you always strive to be, but you're only as good as the data that you get, right? So being honest and knowing that this whole ecosystem is evolving to be better, and there are a lot of companies that are out there like ourselves that are working on trying to provide a fraud-free environment and provide ultimate transparency, that are out there working for you and will eventually, get to a place where we're close to 100, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. Well, I see our job as an agency is to de-risk, on behalf of the client, up front. It's like, here's our playbook. Here are the things that you should know about Digible when we buy programmatic. And, some of that would be, we make sure that the providers we use do have ad fraud technology built into it. And then here's 3 or 4 other things that we consider to de-risk, the amount of ad fraud that you'll be subjected to, on a campaign. And so those are great tips. And you set me up, I think, pretty well for a follow-up, and then I can give it back to David. But when it does come to, okay, we've done everything we can up front, and we know that there's some technology built in as we do get through the campaign and optimize. But what our clients do understand better, I won't say they, most people don't have a PhD in website analytics, specifically Google Analytics, but it would seem basic logic would say, hey, be on the lookout for, how your bounce rate's affected, how your average session, duration looks, where the traffic's coming from, the sources, being that kind of stuff. So I didn't know if you could just talk at a high level. This one, I think, again, would be better probably understood by some of our listeners, but any tips or thoughts around what to look at your kind of back end analytics that might tip you off or should be a cause for concern?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you have a website and you're using an agency to help drive lead generation, look at your Google Analytics. Ask your agency, what campaigns have been launched on what platforms. They can go into their Google Analytics and look at referring URLs and look at some of the data inside of their own analytics platforms to see if traffic is even showing up to their websites, right? I mean, that's the whole gig, right? If you're an owner and you're, have properties that you're leasing and you work with an agency, you should see a spike in traffic if you're really getting users that are going there. I mean, that spike in traffic could be normalized. There could be a whole bunch of things that are happening, but look at the data, right? Like the other thing that you had touched on that's super interesting is that you also want to be aware of, like earlier we had said, hey, in programmatic, we were looking for a bunch of audiences, and programmatic gave us that ability. Well, it turns out that like if you're a let's say, essentially, if how do I want to put this? If you're looking for audiences that are interested in buying cookware, right? I don't even know if cookware is a thing, but I just said.
I'm sure it's
but whatever, right?
Reed has a sous vide. He loves cookware. So
and there you go. Oh, I love the sous vide. But you're going to want to find me in Williams-Sonoma and not 7-Eleven, because the propensity of me transacting at Williams-Sonoma is going to be higher than me buying a Slurpee at 7-Eleven, right? And so context matters. So what I'm trying to say here is that the other thing that your clients could look at is that if they're getting a lot of referring URLs or from places they don't even care to get information from, right? Like that might be a little bit too in detail, because it's going to be like, how are we going to figure out what all of this means? But I guess what I'm trying to say is you have data, and so do your client, and so do your clients, and you both can help each other become better at what you do, because they can supply you with data that they have to give you a better understanding of what's working and not working, because in all of this, it's working together and creating the right solution for the both of you to win. It's actually teamwork. It's not throw it over the fence, because I think there's a lot here that we can learn from by transacting digitally, because of the real-time nature of the data that you get every second of the day.
Yeah, I think it's more what I'm hearing is you should just be having the conversation with whoever your provider is and just asking like, well, what are you guys doing? And then you guys should be trading like conversations back and forth. Like a lot of our audience would probably understand like, okay, I'm getting all this traffic from this source, or what I launched this campaign and all of it's coming from this referrer and it's 1 second on site. So probably not hot. And then next would be like, well, where's the traffic coming from, right? So but I know last year we saw a huge spike in traffic from Brazil, and it's like, well, that's out of the norm. Figure out what's going on in Brazil and try to whack that mole. Quick question though, and I do think it would be fun just to. And
what you just said is not even in some cases isn't even ad fraud, right? It could just be ad ops hiccup. Oh, I accidentally targeted the wrong geolocation.
Right. Well, that's a great point. Like we talk a lot with our customers, like there's the really like end goal of like perfection, but like no one's going to get there. And so you guys shouldn't hold yourself accountable to be at perfection, but there's a lot of basic stuff that you should do. So let me get back to basics for a second here. But Reed had started to ask quick tips around mobile, tablet, whatever. But in a closed ecosystem, like Google AdWords or like Facebook, Instagram, are you safer from this type of thing versus more of the open ecosystem of running programmatic on Trade Desk or let's say email?
Yeah, I would say with anything, the closer you get to the source, the safer you're going to be, right? So if you're working directly with the publisher inside of their ad server, the only fraud you're really going to get there at that point is fake human traffic that is being driven to that site. Like that's a whole other side of the whole other side of fraud that takes place that we didn't even touch upon. But it's like, are the audiences that are going to the real sites real because of traffic generation, right? That's a whole other topic. But in general, the closer you are to the inventory source, the less fraud you're going to have. And I've seen that in our own data. Like when you're working directly within an ad server, the fraud was more upstream than the actual inventory source, but it was like 2% to 3%. And the further you got away from the source, the bigger the percentage became. And it's because of the lack of controls that are in the ecosystem.
Well, that's super interesting, as you mentioned. Like, I mean, a hot topic for us is eliminating fraud on Google search, and a lot of that is like, well, are your competitors clicking on your campaigns, whether knowingly, like on purpose or not, right, to help eat up your budget? Is your on-site staff like just going to your branded campaign or whatever, blowing up your stuff? So there's that problem. But as you mentioned, like, what we had said earlier about Cambridge Analytica and all of the, let's say, bots that are happening on social to help influence, everybody, they may be eating up a lot of the impressions that you're talking about too, right? So it's like it's more of the traffic that's there, less about this spoofing. So Reed, I do want him to get to at some point like how Rebel has imagined to solve this problem, but I didn't know if you wanted to, before we got there, if you wanted to hit any other questions.
No, I think we can move there. I was going to just surface, I guess, the financial implications of ad fraud. We haven't really tackled that or talked about that as much, and that would have been something, and it was for me to, I was highlighting that a little bit, David, when you're talking about how much money actually goes to the publisher. But it's fascinating because, and I don't know if you know this, Manny, but in the, we'll say, legacy side of media, meaning radio, TV, newspaper, that kind of stuff, particularly in the broadcast, they have what's called posting. And so they sell on what are called grips, gross rating impressions. And they will say, this is the frequency and the reach you're going to get with this buy. And then if they don't meet that based on the ratings that then come back from Nielsen and the like, and now all that's evolved as well, then they're required to actually fulfill, those impressions through additional inventory. And that started to, when I was actually at the Post, become more common, an expectation from agencies as we got into viewability and ad fraud. It was like, we're simply not going to be paying and just accept the fact that, 60 or 70% is good. We're only going to be paying for the impressions that are viewed or for non-bot traffic. And I understood that, but that was a shock to the system, and I think it's one that still publishers are grappling with, because a lot of publishers thought that they had this premium inventory, didn't have a bot traffic problem, and that digital was the answer as far as offsetting all the legacy loss that they were experiencing, with their traditional media. And then came kind of this new expectation, and it was as a result of the education about ad fraud, bot traffic and viewability. So I just think it's a fascinating topic. I was kind of curious to get, your take. I don't know how close you've been to that, because, like I said, being in the position that I was before, that was an active conversation I was having to field. But you're obviously helping the problem, but then you're also putting publishers sometimes on their heels, where it's like, shit, we actually have a lot more fraud than we realized on our site. And therefore, now we have to like figure out how to monetize that or deal with that problem, with these bigger agencies that are now putting much higher demands on what they will actually pay for.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, that is a huge, I mean, that's, what in particular there, I mean, that spawns like a ton of different,
well, yeah, it is kind of a big one to put out there. It might be good for follow-up, because, for the listeners, we were talking to Manny for an hour before we started. So he's just a blast to talk to. And I think, we definitely have some fun follow-ups that we could hit with you potentially. So I don't want to take away from, because I think we do unfortunately have a hard stop now at or in 10 minutes. So let's let you, what Dave is saying, just talk to us a little bit more specifically about Rebel.
You just pulled like the eject lever on that.
Well, I mean, I don't care. I just don't want to. I mean, I think it's fair to Manny to let him talk a little bit more about Rebel, but
No, that's fine. Now we could do Rebel in a different podcast. So it like I think I flew out of the plane when you hit the eject button on that one too. Yeah, I mean, look, so I mean, going back to the original question, basically saying, so what was, so let's try to answer this. So what was the original question, which was,
well, it's kind of the financial implications of ad fraud. There's winners and losers, and at the end of the day, it's the publisher's inventory, right? And so they are now being greeted with much higher demands from agencies that are buying on behalf of these like Fortune 500 companies, saying, hey, so you almost have, I don't want to say a conflict of interest, but in some sense, the publishers are like, yeah, we want to demonstrate that we have this great quality and premium inventory. But on the other hand, the more that we do that, the more we find out that we don't have the volume that we did before. And so, it's like, so it's a double-edged sword is all I'm saying, from publishers, and how, and the agencies just don't care. At least that was my experience. They were like, doing the little violin or whatever. It's like, we don't feel sorry for you. Like, we are here to promise our clients. So it's funny, Manny, because you said setting expectations is really important, but a lot of these big agencies are telling, their clients, we're going to give you the purest inventory you could ever imagine. And we don't give a damn what these publishers are telling us. And so I don't know if there's a question, like a good specific question.
I understand what you're saying. I mean, look, here's the thing. It's like, here's what you're saying, or what I'm interpreting. There's a lot of pressure on publishers to provide quality inventory, fraud-free, and they have to deploy a lot of money to get all of these partners on board. And at what point does it stop or make economic sense for the publisher to keep doing that, right? It's almost like a fractal problem. Like, the more you look, the scarier it gets, right? And it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so there has to be some balance, right? Where the economics across the board make sense for everyone. I mean, because ultimately that has to happen, right? And I think there's a balance that is taking place. Like, I think we've reached the point in our industry where people are starting to say, and I think you've probably heard it or read about it, like, the ad tech tax is becoming unbearable. And where is my money going? And how? And I really looked at the numbers, and I'm only getting 1% of margin out of this whole thing. And is the juice worth the squeeze, David? The juice worth the squeeze, right? And a lot of those answers are being answered. A lot of those questions are being answered right now, and the balance is starting to take place, in a sense that they're saying, all right, I love this quantity, but man, it's getting real expensive, right? And so we got to move to quality. And what you're saying is, hey, I'm not going to have 5 fraud vendors. I need just one. And I only need one because I'm not going to sell my inventory to 7 different SSPs. I'm going to sell my inventory to one SSP at most. And I'm going to run a lot of direct campaigns. Oh, and by the way, a new technology that, not new, but a technology that I'm going to start using more is header bidding, because it's going to get me directly to the DSP that I need, that I know is buying my inventory, to reduce my footprint of fraud. So I'm not going to let anyone get into the buying stream on my behalf, because I know I'm connected directly to the buying platform. And so all of these things are taking place, and you've got CFOs at these companies that are saying, all right, well, we need to get back to making a bigger margin on curating all this content. So we need to get smarter about who we work with, and selling to everybody clearly isn't working, right? And so the economics, which is interesting, is fixing some of the fraud problems, and just in general. So I guess to answer your question is that these things are there's a whole slew of things that are taking place that are driven by the margins in all of these businesses to be better by working with. So more is not better, less is better. And that's kind of the theme that's happening right now to reduce some of these problems. But what I will say is that you can look through a bunch of different lenses, and this is a fractal problem. So the closer you get to it, the scarier it will be. But I think if you just look at traditional economics and how business works, I know as a business, if I put $1 in and I don't get $2 out, I'm not going to put $1 in anymore, right? If I put $1 in and get $1.50 out or $1.10 out, I might keep doing it because I can save the 10 cents long enough to make enough money to do something. So if you use so my point here is that you also need to look at the macro value that it's providing your business from a lead gen perspective. And so don't scare yourself. Just know there are people out there working on it and that are trying to get better so that they can squeeze margins out for their businesses. And those are the plumbing players. And so they're incentivized naturally to continue to get better at that because they make more money the more they don't have to. They make more money if they don't have to spend money on fraud providers, basically. And so they're incentivized to continue to try to fix the problem. And publishers are incentivized to use those companies that are doing that because they're going to squeeze more margin for their business because they're using players that are going to reduce fraud and be closer to the buyers. So really it's being fixed in all of those different by looking at all of those different angles. There's not really some silver bullet that says, and not even my technology that says, hey, here's the silver bullet, use this and your problems are gone. Hopefully that's helpful.
It is. Well, I was just going to say that was kind of a masterful response to an oceanic size topic. So well done, Manny. I'll finish here, David. This isn't a question. It's just putting a cherry on that. But there's a danger and it's inevitable. It's so competitive right now. And, when we were at the Post and Ad Taxi was our digital kind of brand or agency that David was doing enterprise deals on, you want so badly to, it's so hard not to make those promises, because everybody's schlepping kind of the same thing. It's such a commodity based space. And so it's a little like search, where it's like, how do you stand up differentiators? Like as an agency, how do you go to market reselling Google, And so publishers are in kind of in a similar spot, and they, I think quickly like almost defaulted to, the quality, the premium. And then that triggered kind of the agencies. Oh, so you're telling us that you have the best inventory, the purest inventory. And suddenly that started going out in waves out into the market to the ad buyers, and to advertisers. Yeah. And so it's like, and then you perpetuate, this unrealistic expectation of what really can and can't be done with relation to ad fraud and bot traffic. And I think that's what some publishers, and I want to say, even agencies are trying to walk back a little bit, but it's not easy. Once the cat's out of the bag, it's like, guess what? Now your client thinks this is the way it needs to be, and it's going to be, and it's the only thing they're going to pay for. So it'll be really fascinating, as you said, so much change and opportunity for innovation, but how those relationships kind of, I guess, evolve or devolve, between the publisher, the agency, and the ad tech companies. So anyway,
yeah. Oh, totally. And I would say that there's only true innovation in the time of war, right? When you really need to do it. And when everybody was making a lot of money, nobody was really incentivized to change anything. But because now it's impacted their pocket and it's impacted the value proposition that a lot of these pillars in the industry have held, it's creating and forcing change. And that's something that we should all be excited about, and right now is like an incredible time to be innovating and working with your partners to really bring unique product to life.
Yeah.
Well, Manny, why don't we let you go out on this, since we'll do a follow up with you on Rebel. But you guys are interesting because, at least to me, because obviously it seems like your heart's in the right spot and you're not like, Dr. Evil, like money grubbing over the whole thing, but you're like, I want to solve this big ass problem. So what I'm getting to is, there's a lot of different anti-fraud providers out there. Should our audience, as a let's say small business or small advertiser, is this something they should be looking at themselves? Like meaning whether it's a Rebel or whoever else, or should they be pushing their agencies to be, working with a vendor like yourself or something like that? But what would be the expectations, or what would be the next best move for them? For a small business, is the anti-fraud tech really something they can get involved with or should be concerned with right now? Or is it it's still too early?
I would say my company and your company exists so that your clients can focus on their value propositions. And jumping into this big world of trying to figure out fraud detracts from their value proposition that they're trying to promote. So here's what I'm trying to say. I think your client would work with companies that they trust and know are digging into these things for them so that they can focus on building their business, right? Now, if they're interested and they want more from you in this regard, by all means, we should share all the information. And if they want to get smart just because they're curious, they should do that too, right? Information is king. Like the more you know, the better off you are, right? But if you saturate yourself with things that aren't your, part of your business strategy, then all of a sudden you find yourself worried about things you can't change. So I would say that, meaning I believe in humanity and people can change anything, but like go and build your business and make money and work with people like that are inside of Digible that are going to do this for you and bring that value so that you can, or any agency, right? Like that, so that you can focus on your business and they will focus on protecting you. And I think that's really important. At some point, there has to be that line of trust. And that's when true partnerships are built to build great things.
Well, that's a great way to put it. It's basically like, don't distract yourself with, like you're saying, outside of your core business, because you've got some other probably important fundamentals to focus on.
I promise you do. Right?
Your providers, you should be asking the tough questions and don't sit idly by and wait till it gets to a boiling point. Like go, ask the question proactively.
Yeah. I mean, I always, if I'm hiring out to do something, it's because I don't have time to do it. And I'm going to hire somebody that I trust to do it so that I can scale my business. And if I'm in a position where I don't trust that that's happening, then I might as well do it myself, and therefore creates less scale for me. So it's just, you got to think about it in that way.
Yeah. I appreciate how for, I'll say an engineer, how focused you are on the business importance versus just saying, like being too altruistic with all of it. Well, this was great, Manny. We had a blast. Is there anything you want to say before we let you go?
Oh, I just want to thank you, the both of you, and thank your audience for listening. I mean, look, this is a great opportunity, and I love, this is my favorite topic, and it's been a blast. So thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Manny.